My name is Walter Jennings, and I turned 76 this fall. I live alone now, in the same weathered house on the edge of town where my wife and I raised our children, a place that once rang with voices, clattering dishes, the smell of fresh bread in the oven, and laughter that stretched into the night, but which now has grown so quiet that I sometimes feel it is listening back to me, waiting for words I no longer speak out loud. The walls still bear the photographs of Thanksgivings long past, framed smiles of children who are now adults with their own homes, their own families, and, apparently, no room left for the old man who once carried them on his shoulders and taught them how to ride bicycles in the cracked driveway. Since Eleanor, my wife of 52 years, passed away from cancer 3 winters ago, the house has become a strange sort of museum, where every object is a relic of a happier time, and every evening feels like a silent vigil. I keep her knitting basket by the sofa where she used to sit, though the yarn has gathered dust. I still sleep on my side of the bed as if making room for her return. Even after all this time, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night and stretch out my hand expecting to find hers, only to clutch a cold sheet and remind myself that she is gone. Thanksgiving, of all holidays, always held a sacred place in my life, not for the food or the football games, but for the ritual of gathering, the certainty that no matter what had happened during the year, we would all sit around one table, carve the turkey, share stories, and give thanks for one another. It was my holiday, or at least that is how I thought of it, the one time I felt indispensable, because for 40 years it was I who prepared the bird, I who sharpened the carving knife, I who stood at the head of the table while my wife placed her, hand on my shoulder, proud that her husband still carried the authority of tradition. I had believed, perhaps foolishly, that this ritual would never be broken, that it would outlive me even, because surely children who grew up in such a warm tradition would carry it forward, just as I had carried it from my own parents. That belief has been eroded slowly, like a stone under water, worn down by subtle slights, missed phone calls, hurried conversations, and the cold efficiency of my daughter's voice on the other end of the line when she calls, not to ask how I am, but to remind me that a tuition bill is due for one grandchild, or a car repair is too expensive, or the mortgage has become unbearable, and could I, just this once, write another check? I always said yes, not because I didn't recognize the pattern, but because each request carried with it the faint possibility that, afterward, they might remember me, invite me, ask me to join them not out of duty, but out of love. The days leading up to Thanksgiving are the hardest, because the town itself seems to come alive with a spirit I no longer share. At the grocery store I see families loading their carts with cranberries, potatoes, and pumpkins, children arguing over pies, husbands and wives whispering about recipes. The radio plays those familiar jingles about gathering together, and church signs out on the roadside proclaim their holiday dinners open to all. I see it all and feel as though I am watching a life that has slipped just beyond my reach. I used to stride proudly through those aisles, carrying the biggest turkey I could find, confident that I would feed an entire clan. But now I find myself buying small portions, 2 apples, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and moving quickly past the freezer section where the turkeys are stacked like monuments to a life that is no longer mine. Neighbors nod politely. Some ask after my health, but no one lingers, no one invites. And I return home with my modest bag of groceries to a kitchen that has grown too large for one man. In the evenings, I sit in my armchair by the front window, the same spot where Eleanor used to read her novels, and I watch the light fade across the neighborhood. I can see other houses come alive with strings of decorative lights, the silhouettes of people setting tables, the blurred movement of grandchildren running up staircases. I imagine what it must be like inside those homes, The smell of pies cooling on counters, the chatter of voices competing with one another, and I feel both envy and a strange shame, as though I have failed not only myself, but the family I once led. The phone rarely rings anymore, and when it does, I feel a jolt of hope that it might be one of my children calling to say, "Dad, we miss you. Come join us this year." But instead, it is usually a telemarketer or a distant cousin with perfunctory greetings. I keep the old landline because it reminds me of Eleanor, who loved its dependable ring, though my daughter has scolded me countless times for not switching to a modern cell plan. To her I am stubborn, out of touch, clinging to relics, but to me, I am holding on to the only anchors I have left in a sea that grows colder by the year. Sometimes, when loneliness presses too hard, I set the dining table as if guests are still coming. I take out the good china from the cabinet, polish the silverware, and place the wine glasses just so, then step back and pretend for a moment that the family will burst through the door any second, noisy, impatient, asking what smells so good. It is a cruel game I play with myself, one I always lose, but it keeps me tethered to a sense of continuity. The silence afterward is unbearable, though, and I often end up sitting there in front of an empty plate, remembering the sound of Eleanor's laughter when she caught me sneaking a taste from the turkey, the way our grandchildren used to crawl under, the table with the dog, giggling until someone scolded them. I wonder if they even remember those moments, or if they have been erased by the speed of their new lives, college exams, new friends, careers waiting just around the corner. Perhaps, in their minds, I am already a figure of the past, a faded photograph that they do not know what to do with. When people ask me how I am doing, I say fine, because there is no word that captures the hollow of sitting in a house that has outlived its purpose. I sometimes go to the Veterans Hall on Tuesdays, where a handful of men my age gather to play cards and share stories. But even there, I am reminded of how different my path has become. Some of them have children who still call every week, who drive in from other towns to take them out for meals. Others are just as estranged as I am, but they mask it with jokes, with bravado. I cannot mask mine. It sits on my face like a permanent shadow. They tell me to sell the house, to move into one of those senior apartments where there is always company, always planned activities. But I resist, because part of me believes that as long as I stay here, surrounded by the memories of family, I am still connected to them. To leave would be to admit fully that I have been left behind. I keep myself busy with small rituals, sweeping the porch, raking leaves, repairing loose shingles on the shed, even though my knees protest and my hands shake with age. These tasks give me the illusion that I am still useful, still capable, still needed. At night, I make myself simple dinners, often more elaborate than they need to be, as though cooking for an invisible audience. I still roast small chickens, bake pies, mash potatoes, though I eat only a portion and freeze the rest. The freezer is crowded with these leftovers, reminders that I have not yet given up the habit of cooking for many. Thanksgiving looms on the calendar like a storm cloud, and despite everything, I find myself unconsciously preparing for it. I bought a small frozen turkey weeks ago, unable to resist, though I told myself I would not go through the trouble this year. It sits in the freezer like a promise or a threat, waiting for me to decide whether I still matter enough to carve it. It was exactly 1 week before Thanksgiving when the phone rang in the middle of the afternoon, startling me out of a light nap in the armchair. The ring had a sharpness to it that pulled me upright, and for a fleeting second my heart leapt with the naive hope that perhaps it was my daughter calling with words of warmth, an invitation, or even the simplest acknowledgement that the holiday could not truly be complete without her father present. I picked up the receiver with more eagerness than I care to admit, pressing it quickly to my ear before it could ring again, and I said her name even before she spoke, my voice almost betraying how long I had waited for it. There was a pause on the other end. Not long, but long enough to remind me of the distance between us. And then her voice came, smooth and businesslike, the same tone she uses when leaving rushed voicemails. "Dad, I wanted to talk to you about next week," she began, and I heard in her measured cadence that this was not going to be the call I had hoped for. I told myself to stay calm, to listen, but my hands already tightened on the receiver because I knew the sound of a speech being prepared in advance. She went on to explain, with the air of someone laying down an unfortunate but unavoidable decision, that the family had decided it would be better if I did not come to Thanksgiving this year. She said it gently, but the gentleness only made it worse because I could hear that she was trying to dress up the rejection in politeness. She said the kids were busy, that the table was going to be crowded, that it would be hard for me to make the drive across town, that maybe it would be easier on everyone if I just stayed home and rested. Her words piled one after another, a string of excuses that sounded rehearsed, and behind her voice I caught the unmistakable murmur of other voices, laughter even, a noise that betrayed that she was not alone while she was delivering this message. I closed my eyes and pictured her kitchen, filled with my grandchildren, maybe even my son-in-law, all bustling with preparations, and I realized with a sickening weight in my chest that they were already gathered without me, that the decision to exclude me was not a last-minute accident but a carefully chosen arrangement. I tried to interrupt, to remind her that Thanksgiving was our family's tradition, that I had always carved the turkey, that her mother would have wanted us together, but she brushed it aside as though I were a child insisting on something. "Impractical," she said. "Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We'll stop by after the holiday, maybe bring you a plate, but for now we think it's just best this way." The phrase "we think" echoed in my mind, not "I think," but "we," meaning it was a consensus, a family decision, and I was not part of the family. In that decision-making, I was the object being decided upon. My mouth went dry, and for a moment I could not find words, because it was as if she had reached across the line and pushed me out of the circle of my own blood. I heard myself saying something faint, a question I cannot even clearly remember now. Perhaps, "Are you sure?" or "Do you mean it?" But she had already moved on, rushing the call to a close, telling me she was busy, that she had to get back to things. Before I could steady my voice to argue, the line clicked, and the call ended, leaving me with the dial tone humming in my ear like a cruel reminder that I had been cut off not only from the conversation but from the life it represented. I sat there with the receiver still pressed against my ear, staring out the window where the afternoon light was dimming, and for the first time in my life, the holiday ahead appeared not as a day of family and gratitude, but as a long night of absence. I thought of the small turkey in my freezer, the one I had bought weeks before out of habit, and I realized that I had purchased it under the illusion that the ritual still included me, that I was still the man who stood at the head of the table, knife in hand, children watching with expectation. Instead, I saw myself in that moment as what I had apparently become to them, an old man sitting alone in a chair, holding on to traditions that no one else cared to honor, waiting for an invitation that would not come. My chest tightened, not just with sadness but with humiliation, because there is a particular shame in being unwanted by those who should need you most. The hours after that call stretched unbearably long. I walked through the house aimlessly, touching the backs of chairs, straightening frames, opening drawers only to close them again, trying to fill the silence that seemed heavier than usual. I thought of Eleanor, how she would have reacted to such rejection, and I imagined her anger, her defense of me, the way she would have stormed into our daughter's house demanding an explanation. I whispered her name into the air, as though conjuring her spirit might give me the strength to do the same, but all that answered was the ticking of the clock. By evening, I had set the small turkey out on the counter to thaw, though I had no appetite, no desire to cook it. It was a gesture more than a plan, a way of telling myself that I could still mark the holiday in some form, even if I did it alone. The following day I received a text message from my granddaughter, brief and almost careless. "Love you, Grandpa. Hope you're well. We'll see you soon." There was no mention of Thanksgiving, no acknowledgement of the decision that had been made about me. It felt like a bandage placed on a wound while ignoring the knife still lodged inside. I stared at the words on the small screen of the phone I barely know how to use, and I wondered whether she even knew that I had been excluded, or whether the story being told to the younger generation was different, perhaps that I had chosen not to, that I was too frail or too stubborn. That thought cut deeper than the rejection itself, because to be misrepresented to your own grandchildren is to have your role as a father and grandfather rewritten without your consent. As the week moved on, I found myself shrinking into myself, avoiding neighbors who asked about my plans, making excuses at the grocery store when clerks cheerfully asked if I was ready for the holiday. I smiled weakly and said yes, though inside I felt like a fraud. Each question reminded me of the reality that my family had decided I was unnecessary, that they could feast without me, laugh without me, give thanks without me. Nights were the worst, when I sat with the lights dimmed, imagining the conversations happening in my daughter's house, the smells of cooking that I could not share, the sound of chairs scraping as everyone took their places. I pictured the empty space at the end of the table where I should have been, and I wondered if anyone even thought to mention my name, or whether day would pass with me existing only as a brief afterthought. I did not cry, though my throat ached with the urge. Instead, I grew cold inside, a numbness spreading through me that I had not felt even at Eleanor's funeral, because grief for a loved one lost to death is at least softened by the knowledge that they did not choose to leave you. This was different. This was a wound cut by choice, by my own blood, by the people who had once clung to me for safety. It was a betrayal that felt almost biblical in its cruelty. And yet there I was, powerless to change it, standing in the ruins of traditions I had spent a lifetime building. That was the moment, though I did not know it then, when something in me began to harden, when I started to understand that if I wanted to be seen, if I wanted to matter again, I would have to step outside the circle they had drawn without me. The days that followed the phone call were marked by a silence in the house that grew heavier with each hour, pressing against me as though the walls themselves were collapsing inward, suffocating me with reminders of what I no longer had. I tried to keep myself occupied with small chores, sweeping the porch, tightening the loose hinge on the back gate, reorganizing the boxes in the attic, but each task only heightened the emptiness that had settled around me. I could not escape the knowledge that Thanksgiving was approaching and that for the first time in my adult life, there would be no seat waiting for me at the family table. My daughter's words repeated endlessly in my mind, circling like vultures, her gentle but firm dismissal disguised as concern. At night, when sleep refused to come, I would replay her voice, picking apart each phrase, searching for any crack of insincerity, any sign that perhaps she had not meant it, that perhaps someone else had forced her hand. But every time I tried to twist her words into something kinder, I would remember the laughter in the background during that call, the sound of people already gathered, and I would realize all over again that it was deliberate, that I was not forgotten by accident but excluded by choice. One afternoon, 2 days after the call, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the small frozen turkey I had pulled from the freezer. It was thawing slowly, a pale, lifeless thing on a tray, and as I looked at it, I realized it was the perfect image of what I had become. Something that once promised nourishment and warmth now reduced to a cold, useless object waiting for a purpose that would never arrive. I felt such a wave of humiliation and despair that I nearly pushed the turkey into the trash, but I stopped myself, unwilling to discard it, because that would mean surrendering even the illusion of tradition. Instead, I left it there, sitting on the counter like a cruel companion, its presence reminding me of everything I had lost. It was during one of these long afternoons, when the sun was sliding low and the shadows were creeping across the living room, that my neighbor, Mrs. Klein, appeared at my door. She was a widow, too, a woman in her early 60s with a kind but sharp face, the kind of person who notices things others pretend not to see. She held a plate of cookies in her hands, still warm from the oven, and said she had baked too many. I knew it was a lie. She had made them for the purpose of walking over here, perhaps sensing the heaviness in my house. I invited her in, though I felt embarrassed at the state of my kitchen, cluttered with reminders of a holiday that would not be mine this year. She sat down across from me and studied me for a moment with the kind of gaze that sees through all defenses. Then she asked simply, "So, what's happening for you this Thanksgiving?" The question landed like a stone, and for a moment I considered inventing a story, some vague explanation that I would be joining family later in the week. But I was too tired for lies. Instead, I told her the truth, though my voice cracked as I said it, that my daughter had asked me not to come, that they were already gathering without me, that I had been politely erased from the picture. Mrs. Klein shook her head slowly, a look of both pity and outrage crossing her features, and she said, "That's cruel. That's not how family should be." Then, after a pause, she added, "Why don't you come here instead? I'm having some people over, a few other neighbors, some friends from church. It's not a big affair, but there will be food and laughter, and you won't be sitting alone." At first I resisted, shaking my head, saying I couldn't impose, that I didn't want to intrude on her family's gathering, but she interrupted me sharply, with the authority of someone who refuses to accept excuses. "It isn't imposing if you're invited," she said, "and my children aren't coming either. They all have their own plans, their own excuses, and I've decided not to beg them anymore. So you see, we're in the same boat. We might as well share it instead of sinking alone." Her words struck me with an odd mixture of comfort and sadness. Comfort because I was not the only one abandoned by those I loved. Sadness because this abandonment had become so common that we recognized it in one another like a secret code. I thanked her, still uncertain, and she left me with the cookies, saying she would expect me on Thursday afternoon whether I liked it or not. In the days that followed, I thought constantly about her invitation. Part of me longed for the company, for the sound of voices, even if they were strangers, because anything was better than the cavernous silence of my own house. Another part of me resisted stubbornly, clinging to the notion that Thanksgiving was supposed to be a family holiday, not something spent among neighbors and acquaintances. But the closer the day drew, the more I realized that refusing her invitation out of pride would only punish me further, while accepting it might give me a brief reprieve from the loneliness gnawing at my chest. On the morning of Thanksgiving, I woke earlier than usual, unable to sleep, my body restless with a nervous energy I had not felt in years. I dressed carefully, choosing the one suit that still fit me reasonably well, the same suit I had worn to Eleanor's funeral. It hung loose on me now, my body having grown thinner over the years, but I pressed it as best I could, determined not to arrive looking shabby. I polished my shoes until they shone, combed what little hair I had left, and even splashed on the aftershave Eleanor had once loved. Though the scent made me ache with memories, I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a man trying to step back into life, even if only for one evening, a man still clinging to the dignity his family had tried to strip from him. When I crossed the street to Mrs. Klein's house that afternoon, The air was crisp with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, the kind of smell that carried me back to childhood. As I approached her porch, I could hear voices inside, laughter rising and falling, the sound of a piano playing faintly in the background. I hesitated at the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob, because I realized I had not walked into a crowded holiday gathering in years. Not since Eleanor died, not since my children began to hold their own celebrations without me. But before I could turn back, the door opened, and Mrs. Klein stood there smiling, her apron dusted with flour, her face lit with genuine welcome. She pulled me inside, and suddenly I was surrounded by warmth, by people who greeted me with curiosity and kindness, who shook my hand as if I belonged there. The house was alive with life in a way mine had not been for a long time. The dining table was already set with mismatched plates and silverware, candles flickering, bowls of food scattered across every surface. The kitchen bustled with people carrying dishes, tasting gravies, refilling glasses. Someone handed me a drink without asking. Someone else clapped me on the shoulder and said they were glad to see me. And before I could even process it all, I was seated in the living room, listening to stories, drawn into conversations, asked about my life. I was not invisible here. I was noticed, valued, welcomed. When Mrs. Klein announced that it was time to carve the turkey, she turned to me, placed the carving knife in my hands, and said, "Walter, would you do the honors?" For a moment I stood frozen, overwhelmed, because the gesture was so simple yet so profound. My own family had taken that role away from me without hesitation. But here, in a room of people who barely knew me, I was restored to the place of honor. As I stood at the head of that table, knife in hand, the turkey steaming before me, I felt something stir inside me that I thought had died. A sense of belonging, of importance, of tradition carried forward. My hands trembled, not from weakness but from the weight of the moment, as I cut the first slice, and the room erupted in applause and laughter. For the first time in years I felt alive, felt necessary, felt like more than a shadow haunting the edges of my own family's life. And though a part of me still ached with the knowledge that my own blood had rejected me, another part whispered that perhaps family is not defined solely by blood, but by those who recognize your worth and welcome you without condition. The moment should have been one of unbroken peace, the turkey carved, the plates passed around the table, the laughter swelling in waves that carried me along like a boat, finally set back on water after too long on dry land. I ate with appetite I had not felt in years, savoring each bite not for its flavor alone, but for the fellowship it represented, the invisible thread of being tied again to something larger than myself. Around me, people talked over one another, sharing stories about work, about small triumphs, about mishaps in the kitchen, and I joined in cautiously at first, only answering when asked, until I realized no one here was measuring me by my age, or by what I could give them, or by how much money I had in my account. They looked at me as a man, not a burden, and I felt lighter with each passing minute, as though a weight had been slipping from my shoulders. But just when I began to believe that perhaps the evening would pass without intrusion from the darker part of my life, my phone, sitting in my jacket pocket, began to buzz. For a moment I thought of ignoring it, pretending not to hear, but habit and hope betrayed me. Some instinct still whispered that perhaps it was my daughter, assistant calling at last to apologize, to tell me they had changed their minds, that a seat had been kept open for me after all. I excused myself from the table, stepping into the quiet hallway, and pulled the phone from my pocket. The screen lit up with her name, and my chest tightened as though I were a boy again, waiting for permission. I answered quickly, breathless with foolish anticipation. Her voice came brisk, almost irritated, as though I had kept her waiting. She did not say Happy Thanksgiving, did not ask where I was or how I was spending the day. Instead, She launched directly into the purpose of her call. She wanted to know if I could send money to her son, my grandson, for his tuition. The semester's balance had come due sooner than expected, she explained, and she and her husband had already stretched themselves thin. Her tone was casual, as if she were asking me to water her plants, as if this were the only kind of interaction we could ever have. I stood in the hallway clutching the phone, listening to her, and behind me I could hear the voices of strangers at Mrs. Klein's table rising in laughter, their warmth spilling through the walls like sunlight, while the voice of my own daughter, the child I had once carried on my shoulders, cut through me with the coldness of a ledger. I asked her, quietly, if she knew where I was, what I was doing at that moment, whether she realized she had barred me from her table while I carved a turkey at another. She grew impatient, told me not to dramatize things, that she had her hands full, that it wasn't personal, just logistics, and then returned to the subject of the money. My hand trembled so hard I nearly dropped the phone. It was not the request itself. God knows I had given before and could have given again. But the timing, the cruelty of calling me not to invite me, not even to acknowledge the wound she had inflicted, but to reopen it with a demand that proved I existed in her world only as a resource. I felt something inside me snap, not with rage but with the kind of clarity that comes when a long illusion finally collapses. For years I had excused her, told myself she was busy, that she still cared in her way, that one day she would turn back to me. But in that hallway, hearing her rush through her plea for money, knowing she was surrounded by my grandchildren and had made no attempt to include me, I understood that I had been holding on to a ghost. My daughter no longer saw me as a father. She saw me as a wallet with a fading memory, someone to be managed, someone to be used. The realization burned through me, leaving behind not emptiness but a kind of grim steadiness, a decision forming even before I knew what it was. I told her, my voice low but firm, that I could not help her this time. For a moment she went silent, stunned perhaps by the word no, a word she had not heard from me in years. Then she began to protest, her tone sharpening, accusing me of selfishness, of forgetting my responsibilities as a grandfather, of putting pride over family. I let her speak, but my eyes were fixed on the doorway back to Mrs. Klein's dining room, where I could see the flicker of candles and hear the murmur of people who had taken me in without asking for anything in return. I told my daughter that I hoped she had a good holiday, that I loved her, but that I would not be sending money today. Before she could reply, I ended the call, my thumb pressing down with a finality that sent a shiver through me. When I returned to the table, Mrs. Klein looked at me with a question in her eyes, as though she sensed something heavy had just occurred. I gave her a small nod, an assurance that I was all right, though inside I felt as though I had walked through fire. As I sat down, one of the men across the table raised his glass to me and said, "To Walter, for carving the turkey better than any of us could." The others cheered, clinked glasses, and in that moment I realized that while my own blood had rejected me, life itself was offering me a second chance through these unexpected companions. My daughter's call, cruel as it was, had clarified something that had been blurred for too long. The family I had once lived for was gone, but that did not mean I had to vanish with it. The night of Thanksgiving ended with an ease I had almost forgotten existed. The dishes cleared away by many willing hands, the last slices of pie divided among the guests, and then chairs pulled into a loose circle in the living room, where stories continued well past the time when people should have been going home. I sat there quietly for a while, content just to listen, feeling the warmth of proximity, the simple miracle of belonging without conditions. Yet even in the midst of this new-found comfort, the echo of my daughter's call still pressed against me, not as a wound that left me bleeding, but as a hard reminder, a proof I could no longer deny. Something had shifted inside me during that conversation, something permanent, and I knew I would never again look at my daughter, my grandchildren, or even my role in their lives through the same lens. For years I had clung to the hope that if I gave enough, endured enough, forgave enough, they would one day turn back to me and recognize the man I still was. Now, though, the hope had been exposed for what it was, a trap that kept me bound while they took what they wanted. The next morning, when the echoes of laughter from the night before still seemed to linger in my ears, I woke with a clarity that startled me. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and went over the call again in my mind, each word of my daughter's request, each dismissive tone, each hint of annoyance when I hesitated. What struck me most was not the demand for money itself, but the casual cruelty of its timing, as though she had deliberately chosen the very moment she knew I would be most vulnerable, most aware of my exclusion, to remind me of my place in her version of family. She had not called to bridge the distance, not even to offer a perfunctory greeting. She had called because she needed something, and in her mind that was the only tether between us that mattered. For the first time, I felt the full ugliness of that truth without trying to soften it with excuses. Over the following days, while the rest of the country basked in the afterglow of family dinners and sales at department stores, I withdrew into myself, not with despair, but with a kind of steady concentration. I began to look at my life as if I were a man surveying a battlefield after the smoke has cleared, assessing what remained, what was lost, and what could still be salvaged. I thought of the years of checks I had written, the endless ways I had opened my accounts, my home, my time, always telling myself it was for the sake of family. But family had not been preserved by those sacrifices. It had been hollowed out, replaced by entitlement, until I had become little more than a convenience, a source of funds, a figure kept at arm's length until needed. The shame that used to weigh me down at such realizations began to burn away, replaced by something sharper. Anger, yes, but also resolve. It was in this state of reflection that another small but devastating event occurred. A few days after Thanksgiving, my mailbox delivered an envelope addressed in my daughter's handwriting. For a brief, foolish moment, I thought it might be a letter of reconciliation, perhaps even an apology written in the quiet after the holiday. But when I opened it, I found inside a printed form from her husband's law office, along with a sticky note in her hand that read, "Dad, please sign this as soon as possible and send it back. It's just a formality, thanks." The form, however, was not the trivial thing she implied. It was a legal authorization that would grant her and her husband shared access to one of my bank accounts, with the reasoning stated as financial management assistance for elder family member. I stared at it for a long time, the words blurring as anger surged through me, and I realized with sick certainty that my exclusion from Thanksgiving had not been only about space at a table. They were preparing the groundwork for something larger, control. The pieces fit together with terrifying clarity. Their sudden insistence that I stay home, their casual lies about logistics, the phone call that reduced me to nothing but a source of tuition money, and now this form. They were crafting a narrative, not just within the family, but perhaps even legally, that I was incapable of managing my affairs, that I was slipping into confusion, that they had to step in. I could almost hear the way they must speak of me to others. Dad is getting forgetful. Dad doesn't handle stress well. Dad is too frail to manage things. With every retelling, they would shift me further out of my own life, until one day I would wake to find decisions being made for me by the very people who had stripped me of dignity. It was not neglect alone I was facing. It was a quiet erasure, a transfer of authority masked as concern. That night I did not sleep. I walked the length of my living room over and over, my mind racing, my heart pounding with both fear and determination. I knew then that my daughter and her husband had crossed a line from which there was no return. Exclusion was one cruelty, but this was theft dressed up as care, betrayal sharpened into strategy. I could not allow it. Something inside me that had long been dormant, the stubbornness, the pride, the will that had once carried me through the hardships of youth and the trials of raising a family, flared to life again. If they wished to paint me as incompetent, then I would show them the opposite. If they thought they could push me quietly into a corner until I ceased to exist, then I would step out into the light and reclaim what was mine. The escalation continued, almost as if orchestrated to test how much I would endure before breaking. 2 days later, my daughter called again. This time she sounded falsely cheerful, asking if I had received the papers. I told her I had, and she rushed to assure me that it was nothing serious, just something to make things easier in the future, that her husband had explained it thoroughly and all I had to do was sign. When I pressed her, asking why it was necessary, she slipped into that same clipped impatience, the one she had used on Thanksgiving Day, telling me not to overthink, that I should trust her, that she was only looking out for me. I could almost hear the script she had rehearsed, the way she had convinced herself that what she was doing was not manipulation, but responsibility. For years I might have swallowed it, nodded, and signed, but this time I told her calmly that I would not. The silence that followed on the line was thick, dangerous. Then she muttered something about me making things harder for everyone and hung up without saying goodbye. It was in that silence after the call that the full reality set in. My daughter was not simply neglecting me, not simply failing me. She was actively working against me, reshaping the story of who I was to suit her own convenience. And in that recognition, I felt a dark clarity. There would be no going back to how things were. She was no longer the daughter who had once run into my arms after school, whose drawings still hang in faded frames on my walls. She had become something else, someone who saw me as an obstacle to be managed, an asset to be extracted, a problem to be solved. I returned to Mrs. Klein's house the following weekend under the pretense of bringing back the dish she had loaned me, but in truth because I needed to speak to someone who could see me as I truly was. She listened patiently as I recounted the letter, the phone call, the form. Her face grew hard with anger on my behalf, and she told me plainly, "You need to protect yourself. They're not going to stop. People like that never stop until they've taken everything." Her bluntness struck me, but it also steeled me. I realized that the only way forward was to act, not with desperation, but with careful steps, deliberate choices. I could not undo the betrayal, but I could decide what it would and would not cost me. As December approached, the air turned cold, the nights longer, and with them my determination solidified. The exclusion from Thanksgiving had been the first public signal of my displacement, a way of removing me from sight so that no one could question their version of events. The form in the envelope was the next step, the legal maneuver. I knew there would be more to come. The escalation was no longer subtle. It was a campaign. But if they believed I would collapse under the weight of it, they had underestimated the man who had survived poverty, war, and loss. They had underestimated a father who had once built a family from nothing, who had buried a wife and still risen each morning to keep going. I looked around my house one evening, at the photographs of Eleanor, at the memories we had built, and I whispered aloud, "They will not take this from me." And in that moment I felt something powerful, not quite hope, not quite revenge, but a sense of purpose, fierce and undeniable. They had escalated the fight. Now so would I. I did not announce war. I did not slam doors or shout into phones. I simply began, step by careful step, to take back the ground beneath my own feet. And by the time the first week of December rolled around, the pieces were in place in a way that felt less like vengeance and more like oxygen. I met with a lawyer recommended by a man from the Veterans Hall who had watched children do to their parents what mine were now attempting to do to me. The lawyer listened without visible judgment, asked for copies of the form my son-in-law had sent, examined my accounts, and then laid out a set of documents with the cool efficiency of a surgeon, a revocable trust in my name with a corporate fiduciary instead of a relative, who might one day confuse love with appetite, a new power of attorney naming the bank rather than blood, updated beneficiaries, transfer on death designations, and a letter instructing the credit union that no third party was to be added to my accounts without my in-person consent. I signed with a hand that did not tremble, and when I walked out into the sharp winter light I felt 10 pounds lighter, not because I had become untouchable or rich, but because for the first time since Eleanor died I belonged to myself again. I told no one except Mrs. Klein, who heard me out in her kitchen with the kettle hissing and nodded gravely and said that safety is not selfishness, that a man has a right to bar his door against a storm even when the wind is carrying the voices of his children. 2 days later the storm arrived in earnest, not as a hurricane, but as a string of messages from my daughter escalating in tone from airy reminders to clipped ultimatums, each one carrying the stale perfume of entitlement. And when I did not answer, she sent one final text that read like a line she had rehearsed in front of a mirror, that if I insisted on being difficult, they would have to formalize care, and that I was forcing her to take steps I would not like. I stared at the words until the letters blurred, and then I did something I had never done with her in my life. I put the phone face down and walked away. The same afternoon, Mrs. Klein knocked and told me her friend on the other side of town was hosting a late Friendsgiving on Saturday for people whose plans had fallen through, and she had said my name, and the friend had laughed with recognition because, as it turned out, her friend lived 2 houses down from my daughter. The neighborhood had seen my grandchildren's cars and the parade of guests on Thanksgiving Day, and they had also seen the unexplained absence of the old man who had been seen visiting in years past. I felt the heat rise in my face, not from shame now, but from a raw energy that felt almost like courage. And when Mrs. Klein asked gently whether I would like to go, I heard myself say yes, not with the hesitation of a beggar fearful of intruding, but with the steadiness of a man choosing where to stand. Saturday came grey and cold, the kind of winter afternoon that paints breath in the air like words you forgot to speak, and I drove with Mrs. Klein through streets bright with early Christmas lights until we turned into a block that I knew better than I wanted to admit. The maple in the center, the curve of the sidewalk, the familiar clapboard house that was my daughter's, cheerful as a postcard and, to me, as unreachable. We parked 2 doors down, where the yard was strung with simple white bulbs, and a long folding table had been set up in the garage in case the wind grew mean. The host, a woman named Pauline with quick eyes and a laugh like a bell, greeted me as though we were old friends and pressed a warm plate into my hands and, without any ceremony, offered me the carving knife when the bird was ready because Mrs. Klein had told her I knew my way around a turkey, and for a second I felt the ground tilt under me, the way a dream jerks when it brushes against reality. I could see through the hedge and the small gap in the fence the side porch of my daughter's house and the bright square of her kitchen window, and I knew with the certainty of weather that someone there would notice me, and I understood that I was choosing this, not as a stunt, not as a petty spear thrown across a property line, but as the clearest way I could say that I was not a ghost waiting in a dark house for permission to exist. The moment arrived, not with drums, but with the soft scrape of a door and the sound of a familiar voice saying my name with disbelief stretched tight over anger. And when I turned, I saw my daughter at the edge of Pauline's driveway in a sweater, recognized from a Christmas long ago, her arms crossed, her face arranged into a smile for the neighbors that did not reach her eyes. She said she needed to speak to me privately, and Pauline, who had the instincts of a general, stepped forward and, with warmth that was also steel, told my daughter that her guest was welcome and safe in her home, that conversations could be had after dinner, and the neighbors, bless them, pretended to fuss with serving bowls while they took up positions that made it clear no one was going to stand by while a daughter dragged an old man into the street. My daughter's smile flickered and then failed, and she leaned toward me and said in a whisper that carried across the concrete that I was embarrassing her, that people were talking, that I should come back to the house and we could sign the forms and put this unpleasantness behind us. And I felt the old reflex rise, the one that had always sent me reaching for my checkbook, for my coat, for any quick solution that would smooth the waters. And then I looked down at the knife Pauline had placed in Maya. Hand. There are moments when a life gathers itself and leaps, not with violence, but with an exactness that makes everything before it seem fogged. And as I lifted the knife and set its edge into the browned skin of the bird, I spoke in a voice that felt like my father's and my father's fathers, slow and clear so that the words would not be mistaken. I said that I would not step into her house, and I would not sign away authority I had not lost, and I would not be the wallet that waited in the dark for orders to arrive like marching papers. I said that I loved her, and I loved her children, but I had put my affairs in the hands of professionals who could not be flattered or bullied, that my accounts were protected, that the trust had been funded, that the bank would speak for me when I chose not to, and that if she believed she could frighten me with phrases about formalizing care, she did not know me and did not understand the word care. I told her that Thanksgiving had already happened for me, a few blocks and a lifetime away, that strangers had welcomed me where blood had barred the door, and I lifted the first slice free and laid it on the platter, and the people gathered in. Pauline's garage broke into applause so gentle and genuine that I had to swallow twice before I could breathe. My daughter's face changed then, and I watched the realization move through her features the way a shadow travels across a field when a cloud passes, understanding first of the practical defeat, that the paperwork she had imagined would be hers to use had been neutralized, and then of something deeper, that the power she had held over me all these years had not been about legal forms at all, but about my willingness to be diminished in order to keep the peace. And that willingness had been withdrawn. She tried a different tack, telling me I was being manipulated by neighbors who did not have my best interests at heart. And Pauline, who had kept her distance to give us room, stepped forward again and offered my daughter a plate and a place at the table, saying that best interests sometimes look like a warm chair and a glass of cider and a knife placed in a man's hand, because you can see that it is the knife he has held most of his life. My daughter did not take the plate. She tugged at the cuff of her sweater like a child and said we would talk later and turned back toward her porch. And for a second I thought I saw her falter, the way a person wavers on ice when they realize it may not hold, and I felt a tenderness. That surprised me, a reminder that she was still the girl who had once slept on my chest during thunderstorms. But I did not call after her, because love does not mean setting yourself on fire to warm someone who will not come inside. After she disappeared into the bright square of her kitchen, the garage seemed to exhale as though it had been holding its breath, and conversation rose again, careful at first and then easy, and Pauline handed me a towel, and I went on carving, each stroke clean and sure, each slice placed where it needed to go, and with every motion I felt a quiet build inside me, not triumph exactly, but the deep relief of a man who has stopped arguing with the tide and learned again how to swim. Someone asked for a toast, and I found words without searching, saying that I had spent the last years believing family was something that could only be lost, that its disappearance was a verdict rather than a choice, and that tonight proved. Otherwise, that sometimes the door you are pushed through leads not into exile, but into a room where people have been saving you a place without even knowing your name. I lifted my glass toward the hedge that separated Pauline's yard from my daughter's and said softly, for myself as much as for anyone else, that I wished no one harm, that I hoped one day those who had turned me away would find their way back not to my money but to my table, wherever it might stand, and that until then I would eat and drink and live among those who saw me as a man and not as a ledger. The neighbors touched their glasses to mine, and Mrs. Klein, eyes bright with unshed tears, squeezed my arm with the fierceness of a sister. When the plates were full and the laughter rose again, I felt the phone vibrate in my pocket, and for the first time in months I did not reach for it, because there would be time later for whatever words were waiting, and because the most important conversation had already happened, the one between my fear and my resolve, and it had concluded with a simple sentence that I finally believed. I belong to myself. I set the final slices in place, laid the knife down, and for a heartbeat the room was very quiet, the way a sanctuary is quiet after a hymn, and I knew that the moment I had dreaded and chased and needed had arrived and passed, leaving me on the other side of it, not young again, not repaired, but true. When the last of the legal papers were signed and the money finally settled into my account, I felt not triumph, but a calm so deep it seemed to reach back through every sleepless night of the past years and smooth them into silence. My daughter and her husband were gone from my daily horizon, not because I had banished them in anger, but because they had already left me long ago, and now I had at last accepted what my heart had fought against for too long. I no longer carried the weight of waiting for a phone call that would never come in love, only in need. I no longer checked the calendar on holidays hoping for an invitation. Instead, I found myself learning again how to mark time by my own rhythms, how to measure a day by the taste of morning coffee and the warmth of a neighbor's greeting rather than by the unpredictable whims of those who had stopped seeing me as family. In the weeks after, my life assumed a quieter, more deliberate shape. I walked by the lake near my new apartment, letting the cold air wake my lungs, and I began to speak again with people who smiled when they saw me, not because they wanted something, but because they were glad I existed. Mrs. Klein and her circle became a steady part of my life. We shared dinners, not grand feasts, but simple meals where laughter rose easily and no one needed to prove themselves. I discovered that belonging is not inherited but cultivated, that sometimes the strangers who open their doors to you in kindness are closer kin than the blood that has grown sour with time. There were, of course, moments when the old ache stirred. I would pass a store window and see a sweater I once would have bought for my daughter at Christmas, or I would hear young voices in the park and imagine my grandchildren among them. At those times the sadness came, sharp and undeniable, but it no longer ruled me. I let it move through me like weather, knowing it would pass, knowing also that grief, like love, never truly ends but changes its shape until it can be carried without breaking you. One afternoon, sorting through a box of Eleanor's things, I found an old letter she had written years ago, a note tucked into my lunch when I was still working, reminding me to eat and not to overwork, ending with the words, "Don't forget, you are loved." I sat at the table holding that piece of paper, the ink faded, but the truth of it as clear as ever, and I realized that my life was not defined by the rejection of my child, but by the love I had known and given freely, by the marriage that had shaped me, by the quiet integrity of doing what was right even when no one thanked me. That memory steadied me more than any legal victory could. As the first snow fell over the town, I decorated my small apartment with a few modest touches: pine branches in a vase, a candle in the window, a wreath on the door. Mrs. Klein knocked one evening with a pie, and said a few of the neighbors were planning a holiday supper together, and would I come? I laughed softly and said I would bring the wine, and for the first time in many years I felt anticipation instead of dread at the thought of gathering around a table. I know now that my daughter may never return to me in the way I once dreamed she might. Perhaps someday the grandchildren will find me on their own, perhaps not. What matters is that I have stepped out of the prison of waiting and into a life that still has room for warmth, for companionship, for dignity. When I wake in the morning, I no longer reach for the phone in fear of what demand might come. I reach for the kettle, for the cup, for the simple act of beginning another day on my own terms. The betrayal will always mark me, but it no longer defines me. What defines me is that I endured it, answered it not with surrender but with resolve, and found a new way forward. Family can be crueler than strangers, but it can also be found again in unexpected places. I have learned that justice does not always roar. Sometimes it is simply the sound of a door closing behind those who meant you harm, and the quiet opening of another door where people are waiting with a smile and a chair at the table. And so my life, once bent under the weight of loss and humiliation, has steadied into something that, while humbler than the family gatherings I once imagined, is no less real. It is enough. I am enough. And as I sit by the lake watching the geese lift into the grey sky, I whisper to myself the words that Eleanor once wrote, words that carry me into every new day. I am loved.